"This seat isn't for you. Please step back." The words, sharp and cold as shattered glass, sliced through the hushed ambiance of the business-class cabin. Brenda Walsh, the chief flight attendant, stood as a sentinel of luxury, her uniform a fortress of crisp lines and starched fabric. Her voice, intended to be a quiet directive, instead acted as a starting pistol. A ripple of amusement turned into a wave of outright laughter, crashing over the woman standing at the edge of the cabin, an anomaly in a world of polished leather and hushed privilege. The woman, Alara Vance, held the strap of a faded canvas backpack, the kind one might see on a mountain trail, not in the rarefied air of Flight 771. Her jeans were soft with age, worn thin at the knees. Her t-shirt was a simple, heather gray cotton that had seen 100 washes, maybe more. There was no makeup to contour her features, no jewelry to catch the light, save for the glint of determination in her calm gray eyes. Her dark hair was pulled back with a simple elastic band, functional and unadorned. The cabin was a carefully curated ecosystem of success. It smelled of dark roast coffee, expensive perfume, and the faint, clean scent of leather conditioner. Alara, with her quiet presence and her worn-in clothes, smelled only of the crisp autumn air she had just walked in from. She didn't fit the scene, and in this world, not fitting in was a cardinal sin. They saw her plainness, her lack of adornment, and they judged it as a lack of worth. A man in a tailored Brioni suit, Marcus Thorne, leaned toward his seatmate, his voice a conspiratorial murmur loud enough to carry, "She must be lost. Surely, they have a separate entrance for the bewildered." Across the aisle, Genevieve Croft, a woman whose wrist was heavy with a diamond bracelet that sparkled with cold fire, didn't bother to lower her voice. Her smirk was a weapon. "My goodness," she declared to no one and everyone. "This airline is really letting standards slip. Anyone can wander in now, it seems." Alara didn't flinch. She had felt gazes like these before, had learned to wear them like a second skin. Her hand was steady as she held out her boarding pass, the paper a silent testament to her right to be there. But Brenda barely glanced at it. With a flick of her wrist, she dismissed it. An impatient queen shooing away a peasant. As Alara stood her ground, a silent island in a sea of contempt, another woman in a tailored blazer leaned across the aisle, her voice dripping with a cloying, condescending sweetness. "Sweetheart," she began, her manicured nails tapping a rhythmic beat of superiority on the armrest. "This isn't a charity flight. Perhaps you should check your ticket again?" It's easy to get confused. The passengers nearby snickered, their eyes darting between the immaculately dressed woman and the silent figure of Alara, hungry for the drama, for the humiliation they felt was inevitable. Alara's lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, with a deliberate grace, she adjusted the strap on her shoulder and let her backpack slide to the floor. It landed with a soft, unassuming thud, yet the sound seemed to cut through the laughter, drawing every eye to the scuffed canvas and its rust-tinged zipper. The woman in the blazer raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, her smirk widening. "Oh, bless your heart," she said, her tone a syrupy poison. Alara finally met her gaze. Her gray eyes were steady, unclouded by anger or shame. "I'm in the right place," she said. The words were quiet, yet they landed like a stone in a still pond, sending ripples of unease through the cabin. The woman's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered, tossing her hair and turning away with a dismissive huff. The moment of quiet was brief. Brenda Walsh stepped forward again, her posture radiating authority. "Ma'am, you are in the wrong section," she stated, her voice now stripped of all pretense of politeness. It was a command. "Step back." She didn't wait for a response, simply pointing a rigid finger toward the curtain that separated them from the economy cabin, as if directing lost traffic. Marcus Thorne chuckled, a hearty, booming sound that filled the cabin. His cufflinks flashed as he theatrically adjusted his Rolex. "Come on, lady. Don't waste our time," he called out, playing to the crowd. "Some of us have important places to be." Alara's fingers tightened on her boarding pass, the paper crinkling faintly. It was the only outward sign of any pressure she felt. Her face remained a placid mask. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood there, her eyes slowly scanning the cabin, moving from face to face, from smirk to sneer. It was not the look of an intimidated woman. It was the look of a collector, memorizing every specimen of cruelty laid out before her. The air in the cabin crackled with a cruel, festive energy. Tristan Cole, a young man with hair slicked back by a copious amount of gel, had his phone out, filming discreetly but obviously. "This is gold," he muttered to his seatmate, a grin spreading across his face. "She's going to be viral by tonight. Hashtag entitled wanderer." He was already crafting the narrative, casting Alara as the villain in a story she hadn't even auditioned for. The woman with the diamond bracelet, Genevieve, clapped her hands together lightly, the sound sharp and metallic. "Good riddance," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Someone, please escort her out before she touches the upholstery." Alara's steps were steady as she began to walk, not toward her assigned seat, but back toward the rear of the cabin, following the direction of Brenda's pointed finger. The laughter followed her, a chorus of jeers and whispers. Tristan kept filming, his voice a low, mocking narration for his future audience. And look at her go, the walk of shame. Thought she could sit with the big dogs. She passed a young boy, perhaps 10 or 11, sitting with his mother. The boy, Leo, had wide, curious eyes that weren't filled with the same mockery as the adults. He watched Alara with an expression of pure, unadulterated confusion. He saw a woman being told she didn't belong, and his young mind couldn't grasp the reason. He looked at her as if he wanted to say something, to ask a question, but his mother, a woman in a plain sweater who clearly felt out of her depth, placed a gentle hand on his arm, a silent command to stay uninvolved. Ilara's gaze met the boy's for a fleeting second, and in that moment, a flicker of something soft, almost sad, crossed her features. Then it was gone. She kept walking, her backpack bouncing lightly against her hip, until she reached an empty seat near the galley, just shy of the economy curtain. As she settled in, a younger flight attendant, her eyes nervous and apologetic, approached her. She hesitated, then offered Alara a glass of water from her tray, her hands trembling slightly. "Is this okay, ma'am?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Alara looked up, her expression softening for the first time. She took the glass, her fingers brushing the flight attendant's. "Thank you," she said, her tone quiet but warm. The simple act of kindness was a stark contrast to the venom that had filled the air just moments before. The young woman gave a quick, almost bowing nod and hurried away. The gesture, however small, did not go unnoticed. A woman in a cashmere scarf leaned toward her seatmate and hissed, "Why is she getting special treatment now? She should be in the back." The mood in the cabin shifted subtly. The mockery was still present, but now it was laced with a thread of uneasy curiosity. The show wasn't quite over, and the script had taken an unexpected turn. Alara paid them no mind. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a book, a worn paperback with a creased spine and softened corners. The kind of book that has been read and reread, loved not for its cover but for the world inside. She opened it and began to read, her posture relaxed, as if she were in her own living room. The engines rumbled to life, and the plane began its taxi toward the runway, but inside the cabin, the real turbulence was just beginning. The ascent into the clouds did little to clear the heavy atmosphere inside the cabin. The laughter had faded into a low hum of self-satisfied murmurs, but the tension remained. Passengers kept glancing back at Alara, who seemed completely absorbed in her book. Her stillness was unnerving. It was the calm at the center of a storm of their own making. Tristan Cole was still filming, now adding a smug narration. "Humiliated passenger, take one," he whispered to his phone's camera. "Banished to the back, but she's still here, folks. Can't take a hint." His seatmate, a woman wrapped in a fur-trimmed coat, giggled and leaned in to watch the screen, her whisper loud enough to carry. "She's probably too embarrassed to move now." Alara turned a page, her breathing even, her hands steady, but her eyes, for a moment, flicked to the window. Outside, the sky was a canvas of bruised gray clouds, gathering as if in sympathy with the storm brewing inside the aircraft. Then Brenda Walsh was back. Her heels clicked on the floor with renewed purpose, an announcement of her authority. She stopped in front of Alara's new seat, her hands planted firmly on her hips, her face a mask of cold intolerance. "This seat is reserved," she said, her voice cutting through the engine's drone. "It's for crew rest on long-haul flights. You need to move, again." The implication was clear. There was no place for Alara here at all. Before the next wave of laughter could crest, A man in a pinstriped suit stood up, his voice dripping with theatrical sarcasm. "What's next?" he crowed, turning to the cabin with his arms spread wide as if he were a game show host. "Is she going to claim she's the pilot?" The cabin roared. This was the entertainment they had paid for. Passengers clapped, some banged their hands on their tray tables in mock applause. It was a circus, and Alara was the main attraction. Her eyes flicked up from her book, meeting the man's for a fleeting second. She said nothing, but her gaze held a weight that was heavy and unyielding. The man's laugh faltered, his arms dropping awkwardly to his sides as he sank back into his seat, his bravado suddenly evaporating under that silent scrutiny. Brenda, seizing the moment, grew louder, her voice sharp with finality. "You heard me. Move," she snapped, pointing not toward economy, but back toward the jetway door they had come from, an impossible and humiliating command now that the plane was in the air. Out of this cabin. The words landed like a punch, but still, Alara didn't flinch. She deliberately placed her bookmark between the pages, closed her book, and stood up, her backpack in hand. The cabin watched, a pack of wolves hungry for the final act. But Alara's silence was louder than their noise. It was a void that absorbed their hatred and reflected nothing back, leaving them to stew in their own ugliness. "Oh, this is too good," Tristan said, zooming his camera in on Alara's face, trying to capture a tear, a crack in her composure. "Just throw her off already," Genevieve Croft called out, her diamond bracelet jingling as she clapped again, a gleeful, cruel sound. Alara looked directly at Brenda, her expression unreadable. "Where should I go?" she asked. Her voice was soft but clear, carrying the simple, disarming logic of a child asking for directions. The calm question seemed to throw Brenda off balance. "Out! Out of this cabin," she sputtered, her professional facade cracking under the strain. "You don't belong here." Alara simply nodded, and she began to walk, not to the back, but toward the front of the plane, toward the cockpit and the main exit door. As she moved down the aisle, the circus reached a fever pitch. "Hey lady, next time book Spirit Airlines," a man in a designer sweater shouted, his face flushed. The cabin erupted again, the laughter louder and more vicious than before. Alara paused for a single moment. She turned her head slightly, her eyes locking onto his. "I'll keep that in mind," she said, her voice so placid it was chilling. The man's grin froze on his face, his expensive watch suddenly feeling too tight on his wrist. The laughter around him sputtered and died, replaced by a few awkward coughs. A crack had appeared in their collective certainty. She reached the front of the cabin where a technician stood by the door, reviewing a checklist on a clipboard. Alara leaned toward him and said something, her voice too low for anyone else to hear. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. The technician's eyes widened. He straightened up as if he'd been jolted by an electric current, his posture snapping to attention. His clipboard dropped to his side. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice sharp and deferential, the voice of a soldier receiving an order from a general. The cabin went quiet. The abrupt shift was jarring. The laughter was gone, replaced by a thick, confused silence. "What's going on?" Genevieve muttered, leaning forward in her seat, her brow furrowed. Tristan had stopped filming, his phone held frozen in his hand. And then the intercom crackled to life, not with the pilot's smooth, reassuring tone, but with a sharp, electronic burst, followed by a voice booming through the cabin, the technician's voice, now amplified and official. "Code Black, owner on board." The words hit the pressurized cabin like a physical blow. Heads snapped around. Whispers ceased mid-syllable. Genevieve Croft's wineglass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor and scattering ice cubes like fallen diamonds. Brenda Walsh's face drained of all color, leaving a pale, sickly mask. She stood frozen, her arms still crossed, the polished badge on her chest catching the light. No longer a symbol of authority but a target. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling, denying the reality that was crashing down upon her. "You have no authority here." But it was too late for denial. The cockpit door swung open. Out stepped Captain Miller. He was a tall man with silvering temples and a face etched with the calm authority of someone who had spent thousands of hours navigating storms. His uniform was immaculate, his presence commanding. He didn't scan the cabin, his eyes went straight to Alara. He walked to her, stopped a respectful distance away, and stood at attention. "Welcome aboard, Madam Vance," he said, his voice clear and resonant, carrying to every corner of the now silent cabin. He then bowed his head, a slight but profound gesture of deference. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that rings in your ears. It was the sound of a world being turned upside down. Brenda's arms dropped to her sides, her whole body seeming to deflate. Tristan lowered his phone, his mouth hanging open. Genevieve's hands, which had been clapping with such glee, were now frozen mid-air as if she'd been turned to stone. "What just happened?" someone whispered from the back, their voice thin and reedy. Before the shock could fully settle, one man, his face flushed with a mixture of wine and defiance, struggled to his feet. "This is a publicity stunt," he declared, his voice trembling. "She's nobody." He looked around, seeking support, but was met with a sea of blank, terrified faces. Alara's gaze flicked to him. She tilted her head slightly, as if studying a curious puzzle. "Nobody?" she repeated, her voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, yet it seemed to shake the very foundations of the man's confidence. He collapsed back into his seat, his bravado vanishing like smoke. The captain cleared his throat, his eyes still fixed on Alara, waiting. The entire cabin held its breath. Alara didn't move. She just stood there, her worn backpack still slung over her shoulder, her face an unreadable mask of calm. This quiet woman, this nobody, now held the fate of every person in that cabin in the palm of her hand. Her silence was louder than any shout they had hurled at her, her presence filling the space like a rising tide. "This can't be real," a woman in a navy blazer stammered, her face pale with panic. "She's just a passenger." "It's a scam." "It has to be," Genevieve Croft snapped, her voice shrill, but wavering with the first notes of fear. A few passengers still had their phones out, but they were no longer filming with mockery. Their hands were shaking, their faces filled with a dawning horror. Brenda was visibly trembling now, her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides, her eyes locked on the floor, unable to look at the woman she had so thoroughly humiliated. Then, cutting through the rising tide of panicked disbelief, came Alara's voice, as calm and steady as a heartbeat. "This is my flight." She reached into her backpack, the same scuffed bag they had ridiculed, and pulled out a small, heavy card made of brushed metal. The airline's logo, a stylized silver hawk, was engraved in sharp, clean lines. She held it up for just a moment, letting the cabin lights glint off its surface. It was a symbol of ultimate ownership, an irrefutable key to the kingdom. Then, just as calmly, she slipped it back into her bag. The captain took a step forward, turned to the stunned audience, and knelt slightly, his head bowed toward Alara. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice a gavel striking down the final verdict, the owner of this airline. The words landed. A collective gasp swept through the cabin. Some passengers leaned forward as if to get a better look, while others sank back in their seats, trying to make themselves smaller, invisible. A woman in a silk blouse began to cry softly, her hands covering her face. The cabin was chaos now, but not the loud, jeering chaos from before. This was the quiet, internal chaos of realization. It was the horrifying sound of people replaying their own words, their own laughter, their own cruelty in their minds. It was the chaos of shame. Tristan Cole stared at his phone as if it were a venomous snake, the gold content he had captured now evidence in the trial of his own character. His face was ashen. Genevieve Croft looked away, her fingers twisting the edge of her fur coat, her diamonds suddenly feeling like weights of guilt on her wrist. Alara Vance didn't say another word. She turned and walked back to her original seat in the front row, the one Brenda had told her wasn't hers. The aisle parted before her as if by magic. She sat down, placed her backpack at her feet, opened her worn paperback to the bookmarked page, and began to read again, as if nothing at all had happened. But everything had changed. The very air in the cabin felt different, heavy with the weight of what they had done, thick with a silence born, not of peace, but of profound and suffocating shame. As Alara settled back into her seat, the world outside her book a maelstrom of silent regret, a small voice cut through the tension. "You're awesome." Every head turned. It was the young boy, Leo, from row 12. He was standing on his seat, his backpack slipping to the floor, his small face beaming with pure, unadulterated admiration. His mom gasped, pulling at his arm, her eyes wide with fear and embarrassment. But the boy didn't sit down. He had seen not a power play, but a quiet victory of dignity, and his child's heart recognized its truth. Alara looked up from her book. Her calm gray eyes met his, and for the second time, her expression softened. A small, genuine smile touched her lips, a smile that conveyed more than words ever could. It was an acknowledgement, a thank you. The cabin watched the exchange, the shame deepening. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. Marcus Thorne stared intently at his tray table, as if it held the secrets of the universe. The man in the pinstripe suit who had joked about her being the pilot seemed to shrink in his expensive clothes. Leo finally sat down, his face glowing, and his mom squeezed his hand, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. The moment hung in the air, a quiet rebellion against the cruelty that had preceded it. A few minutes later, a man in a dark, impeccably tailored suit stepped into the cabin from the jetway, which had apparently been reconnected. He was tall, his face calm but commanding. He didn't need an introduction. The way Captain Miller straightened his posture and the way the technician stepped back respectfully said enough. He walked directly to Alara's seat, leaned down, and spoke to her in a low voice, for her ears only. She nodded, her eyes still on her book. The man, her husband, then stood beside her seat, his hand resting lightly on the back of it, not as a protector, but as a silent partner. His presence filled the cabin, a final, unspoken confirmation of who Alara Vance was. Not rescued, but recognized. Captain Miller stepped forward, his voice steady. "Madam Vance, your instructions?" Alara finally closed her book, her fingers lingering on the worn cover. She looked up, her gaze finding Brenda Walsh, who was still standing frozen near the galley. "The chief flight attendant," she said, her voice devoid of anger or triumph, simply stating a fact. "Collect your belongings and leave this plane." Immediately, Brenda's face crumpled. There were no tears, just a hollowing out of her features. She didn't argue. She turned, her heels no longer clicking with authority but shuffling with defeat, and walked toward the back of the cabin. Her polished badge caught the light one last time before she disappeared. A woman in a linen suit whispered to her seatmate, her voice shaky. "She can't do that, can she?" The seatmate, a man with a goatee, never took his eyes off Alara. "She just did," he breathed, his voice low and reverent. A tentative applause started, soft at first, then growing, but it wasn't triumphant. It was cautious, hesitant, as if the passengers were testing the air, unsure if they were even allowed to clap. It was the applause of relief, of fear, of a desperate attempt to align themselves with the new power. Alara didn't acknowledge it. She opened her book again. But Leo, in row 12, clapped louder, his small hands making a fierce, honest sound that cut through the cabin, a reminder of who had seen her clearly from the very beginning. The next day, the story exploded. Not from Tristan's deleted video, but from official channels that framed it not as a humiliation, but as a case study in corporate integrity. Undercover billionaire ejected from her own flight reclaims it with 4 words, "This is my flight." The fallout was swift and silent. Tristan Cole found his social media accounts suspended, his name a trending topic for all the wrong reasons. His fledgling marketing firm was dropped by its clients before noon, citing conduct unbecoming. Genevieve Croft, the socialite, saw a multi-million-dollar sponsorship deal for a jewelry line vanish overnight. The brand quietly issued a statement about valuing humility and respect. Marcus Thorne was asked to step down from the board of a prominent charity. Carla Walsh was a mere footnote, her name a cautionary tale whispered among airline crews for years to come. They never saw it coming, because they had never bothered to truly see it all. As the plane began its final descent, the young, nervous flight attendant from earlier approached Alara again. This time, she carried a single, folded note on a small silver tray. "From the crew, ma'am," she said, her voice still trembling, but now with sincerity and respect. Alara took the note. The handwriting inside was neat, the words simple. "We are sorry. Thank you for your grace." She folded the note and slipped it into her backpack, her face unreadable, but for a moment, her eyes softened. The flight attendant backed away, her hands clasped, and the cabin watched, silent. Alara Vance didn't stay to watch the fallout. She didn't need to. She stepped off the plane in a new city, her worn backpack slung over her shoulder, her husband walking quietly beside her. The airport was a river of anonymous, rushing people, but a few heads turned, a few whispers followed her. Not because of her clothes, not because of her face, but because of the way she moved calm, steady, with the quiet certainty of a person who knew exactly where she was going. As she walked toward the exit, the boy from row 12 passed her, holding his mother's hand. He waved, his backpack bouncing on his shoulders. Alara paused, met his eyes, and nodded back, a soft, genuine smile gracing her lips once more. Years ago, she had stood in a library filled with the scent of old books and wisdom, her mother's voice a guiding echo in her ears. "You carry our name." She hadn't fully understood it then, the weight and responsibility of it. But now, walking through the polished airport terminal, her sneakers scuffing the floor, she did. She didn't need to shout her name. She didn't need to wear it like a crown or wield it like a sword. The truth was enough. And for everyone watching, for everyone who had ever been judged, dismissed, or laughed at, her silence, her quiet, unshakable dignity, said it all. You were not wrong. You are not alone. The world will see what it wants to see, but the truth, like gravity, always, eventually, catches up.